What's up, you guys? My name is Aubrey and this is my channel, and today we're going to be talking about payments and forgiveness for the PPP and the EIDL program. I'll be going over some of the permitted uses of funds for both the PPP and the EIDL, and I'll also be talking about how to use these funds in conjunction with one another to increase the probability that your PPP will be forgiven in its entirety. So if you are a recipient of either the EIDL, the PPP, or both, you will not want to miss this video. So let's get started. So a couple of things that I want to preface before we get started is that talking about the way that these funds and these programs need to be spent can get confusing rather quickly. And so I'm going to try my best to explain this in as much of a clear way as possible. And because of that, there may be details here and there that I leave out due to simplicity's sake. But I will also be typing out this explanation in its entirety down in the description below. I will also be citing all of my sources so that if you have any other questions or if you feel like I didn't touch on something in quite as much detail as you would have liked, you can go through and read the exact articles that I pulled this information from. Secondly, I want to state that there has recently been a bill that has passed the House this past week, and it is a PPP kind of flexibility bill. It adds flexibility to the forgiveness of the PPP. I'm going to be basing all of this information for the PPP off of this newest bill because it is expected to pass the Senate and to be signed into law by President Trump. So I don't see there being any use on making a video based off of the terms laid out in the CARES Act, because it seems like in the next week or two the terms are going to change based off of this newest bill, and for the sake of keeping the information as relevant as possible, I'm going to be outlining the information given in that bill. So with that being said, let's dig in. So first, let's talk about the EIDL grant and the EIDL loan, which I'll be referring to from here on out as just the EIDL. Now, the EIDL has pretty broad terms as to what they consider permitted use for the loan. And basically anything that is considered a financial obligation or a business expense that would have been able to be covered had COVID-19 never occurred is considered to be a permitted use. Now, it's important to remember that the EIDL loan is not forgivable, meaning regardless of what you spend it on, you will have to pay the funds back. But just because the terms of the funds don't change depending on how you spend it, it is still important to spend them in a permitted way, because there is a chance that you could be audited later on down the road, and if you don't spend them on permitted use, then you could end up being punished in the long run. A good rule of thumb for the EIDL is that the funds were intended to be used to kind of retain the status quo. They were intended to help businesses stay afloat and stay open, but they were not intended to be used to help businesses expand or grow. Meaning that if you were wanting to use the EIDL funds to grow or expand your business, chances are that use is not permitted, and you instead need to be using the funds for just general business expenses or general financial obligations that you would have had regardless of COVID-19. Now, while I consider the EIDL to be a pretty straightforward program, I think the exact opposite could be said for the PPP. The PPP has quite a lot of guidelines and regulations set forth for the forgiveness of the loan. And while the EIDL is a loan that you have to pay back regardless of how you spend the funds, the PPP is different, and the PPP is a forgivable loan depending on how you spend the funds. So with the PPP, 60% of the funds have to be spent on payroll costs, and the other 40% have to either be spent on mortgage interest payments, rent payments, or utilities. The other thing that's important with the PPP is that you have to spend the funds within 24 weeks. You have to hire back the same number of staff members you had before COVID-19, and you have to pay those staff members the same rate you were paying before COVID-19 hit. The other thing that's important to note about the PPP is that if you spend the funds on the right things but in the wrong ratio, meaning that you're not doing it in that 60-40 split, you risk not only having to pay the funds outside of that ratio back, but you'll also have to pay a 1% interest on those funds. And while the EIDL program has incredibly attractive interest and loan terms, the PPP is pretty strict, and you have to pay it back within 5 years at 1% interest for any of the funds that you spend outside of the permitted use range. So now let's talk about how to use the PPP and the EIDL together. Let's first talk about the PPP and the EIDL cash advance. So if you are a recipient of the PPP and you're also a recipient of the EIDL cash advance, the cash advance will be deducted from the forgiveness of the PPP. So let's give you guys an example. So if you are somebody who received a $30,000 PPP loan and then you also received a $5,000 EIDL cash advance, then even if you follow the PPP guidelines 100% of the time and you were able to get 100% of that loan forgiven, you would only be able to get 30,000 of those funds forgiven, despite the fact that you were given 35,000 in funds. So basically what it's saying is that if you got a 30,000 PPP, but you also got a 5,000 cash advance through the EIDL, you do not get a total of 35,000 of free money. You only get 30,000 because it's 25 of the forgiven PPP plus 5,000 of the cash advance, which was free money, and you combine those two to equal out to the total 30,000 given through the PPP. So your cash advance will be deducted from the forgiveness of the PPP regardless of the guidelines that you follow while spending the PPP funds. Now, what about if you are somebody who received the EIDL loan and the PPP? It's important to note that if you are somebody who received both of these funds, that the EIDL funds and the PPP funds were not intended to be used for the same things. And while the EIDL advance gets deducted from the PPP forgiven, the EIDL loan should not affect the PPP unless you spend it on the same things, which is something you should not do. So as long as you spend the EIDL funds as they were intended to be used and you follow the guidelines outlined for the PPP, you will not have the forgiveness of the PPP funds be affected as long as you don't spend the funds on the same thing. So if you start using the EIDL for payroll costs, that will affect your forgiveness for the PPP. And so you want to make sure that you are spending these things on different things and that you use the EIDL on business obligations and financial obligations and use the PPP for payroll and utilities costs, and you do not have these two paths cross, because if they do, it will affect the forgiveness of the PPP. And lastly, let's talk about refinancing your EIDL loan using your PPP. So if you are somebody who applied for the EIDL loan after April 3rd and you use the EIDL funds to meet payroll costs, then there is a good chance that you probably need to refinance that loan using the PPP. And how that would work is that you would end up having to file some paperwork and you would get a larger PPP loan, and you would basically use those extra PPP funds to pay down your EIDL. And as long as you use those EIDL funds for things like payroll and permitted PPP use, then those EIDL funds could essentially end up being forgiven through the PPP and by refinancing those EIDL funds through the PPP program. So you guys, I know that this entire thing is incredibly confusing, and staying up to date with the EIDL, the PPP, and the rules and regulations associated with those programs is like a full-time job in itself. So my goal with this video is to outline the guidelines in as easy to understand way as possible. And I know that because of that, I may have oversimplified some things, but again, I will include the information in the description below, as well as all the sources linked in the description as well. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you need any clarifications, make sure to leave a comment below. I will try my best to respond to every single comment I get. And while you're at it, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.